Hello, everybody. Welcome to Strategy and Future. My name is Jacek Bartosiak, and with me today is again our favorite guest, Nicholas Meyer, Senior Fellow at Strategy and Future. Hi, Nick. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine, Jacek. You can hear the Scottish garbage men outside. The S&P has won the election, so they're consenting to pick up our trash again.
Cool. And in Warsaw, in Poland, where I'm based, finally sun came, so we have the spring, and people enjoy it. So the hopes that the pandemic will be gone soon are also on the, sort of in the air, so to speak. We will be talking today about the aftermath of the showdown on the Ukrainian border between Russia and Ukraine, with some involvement on the US and European powers, and those force deployments. What that meant, what it means, what happened afterwards, and the conclusions that Nicholas Myers is having for us. So go ahead, Nick.
Well, thank you, Jacek. So the last bit of actual intelligence that I picked up on that I don't remember seeing in any of the open source reporting that a whole bunch of people had been doing, like taking pictures of trains and things, is that the Caspian flotilla actually moved a sizable group of its Marines to Rostov Oblast, so right on the eastern border of Ukraine. And I don't remember this being reported by anybody. Now, most of my research is not on Twitter or Telegram or any of the other places where they're going through this. I mostly look through official sources and then try to match that with what's being reported in various tabloids in Russia and Ukraine. So perhaps somebody did pick up on that. But it's interesting, in my opinion, that even with all this increased scrutiny, the open source world did not get every major movement that was going on, even though we saw the most important ones. So I think at this point, we're now safely in phase 3 of this whole operation. And I don't think it's going to be especially dangerous for at least another week. And probably we're not going to see anything serious again until at least July, when they begin doing the preparations for Zapad 21. But I want to put some context on the exercises that we ultimately saw. So I have a couple of statistical screens here I want to show. So this here is a visual representation of all the times that different Russian units from around Russia sent forces to Crimea from 2014 to 2020. And the arrow grows as the frequency of occasions grows. And we see it's honestly not too many occasions overall. The main partner going in there is people from the Southern Military District that's already across from the Black Sea anyway, with occasional Northern Fleet visits, that big arrow coming from the Murmansk area. So it's somewhat interesting that we had the VDV from the main part of Russia, as well as the 58th Army from the North Caucasus coming, because they don't typically reinforce Crimea. So that is somewhat interesting. Similarly, if we look at the East Ukrainian border, we have all sorts of occasions in which there's reinforcements coming from elsewhere in the Southern Military District, including sometimes from Crimea, and then quite a lot from the Western Military District as well, especially during Kavkaz 2020. But you'll see in the bottom corner here, the Caspian flotilla has not historically been one of those forces that have reinforced Rostov Oblast area. So the fact that that 177th Marine Regiment formation, it did its Kontrolnaya Poverka right on the Ukrainian border, is also quite interesting in that it's not at least an open source tradition. And lastly, if we look at the North Ukrainian border, this one, since the units in that area are relatively new and they've been actually recommissioning a number of the polygons, there's relatively few exercises overall that have occurred in this section of Russia the last number of years. They were mostly shutting these things down, as I believe we talked about last time, but before 2014. And here, the reinforcements were from the 41st Army in Siberia. And again, that is unprecedented. In fact, this is the first time, at least in open source reporting, that the Central Military District has sent forces into this area of responsibility since 2014. So again, this is possibly the sign of a growing signal for strategic mobility, and possibly just showing that there is more flexibility within the Russian armed forces than we anticipated overall. Because over the past several years, there's been a lot of regularity in terms of what units will frequently go where. Like if you see in the this previous one, like the notion of the area of the 49th Army and 58th Army reinforcing the eastern border of Ukraine is not especially new. It happens pretty frequently. But it's definitely into a circumstance now that Russia has some degree of flexibility of these cross deployments. The last thing I would point out as something special is if we look at the Western High Command's division of strategic directions, northwest, west, and southwest. This is clearly a southwest strategic direction exercise overall. But if we look at the previous exercises, way back when, before 2014, the major exercises the Russians did were focusing on the Western strategic direction. You'll remember this in Poland, especially because this is when the Russians would just send as many forces as they could straight up to the Polish-Belarusian border and see how they could mass for an offensive. Then after 2014, they switched to the Northwest strategic direction. It became much more of what gets standardly called a hybrid scenario. That we can go about that in much more detail if we decide to do so. But in this particular exercise, they're leaving. The 41st Army has left its equipment behind in Polanovo, Voronezh Oblast, overtly just ready for Zapad 2021, which means that this might be the first major exercise that's going to be in the southwest strategic direction. And that's true. That is also big news that we need to be aware of. Now, in terms of the...
Well, Nick, what?
Yes.
Just for the layman, okay, that
Yeah.
might listen to us. What would that mean? What sort of implications that would cause and what that means, actually?
So what it literally means is that this is where the bulk of the forces are probably going to be concentrated in September, with a couple of preliminary exercises they're almost certainly going to be doing over July and August. There's probably going to be something called the Snapmaya Proverka, the snap checks that they're going to do. It is going to say, 100,000 people show up near Ukraine over the summer, because they typically do this in advance of the exercises. They may not do it since this is an area under the 2011 Vienna document, so they might try to cover up something or do it further back inside of Russia. But it does mean that the details we're going to see from this exercise are going to be much more how Russia is thinking about fighting in Ukraine. And that's important because the last series of exercises have not been about that. There's been a variety of discussion going on about what Russia's going to theoretically do about Ukraine. There's been a whole bunch of rearmament of the 20th Guards Army, which is that area within the Western Military District, within that dotted line to the southwest strategic direction. And we could talk about some of their specializations within that. But the past several major exercises in the Western Military District have all been about stopping supposed Western terrorists coming in and disrupting Russia and then launching a counterattack to stop the Western supply lines to these illegal organizations. And that has always resulted in needing to get into the Baltic states in order to relieve Kaliningrad from the supposed attack that NATO is doing. This time it's going to be different, it looks like. They may incorporate that on the side because the Russians are very big about signaling that they can deal with horizontal escalation that the West might attempt. But it's not going to be the main show. I think we should expect that the main exercise areas are going to be in Voronezh Oblast, where the 20th Guards Army headquarters is, with side events going on elsewhere along the Ukrainian border. And I think the most interesting part is actually going to be near the Russia, Ukraine, Belarus tripoint, like Bryansk and Smolensk oblasts. So the last point I would make before I open up to just whatever questions you have is that we saw an interesting dynamic this time. Typically, when Russia does a major mobility exercise or a demonstration of mobility exercise, they love to brag about it. They may not release much information about it, but you'll see something about, oh, we moved an army from a unit from one side of the country to the other, and they were able to they had total interoperability with other Russian armies. It's something they're very proud of, and justly so. Russia's a big country, and it's difficult to move across it. This time, the open source reporters caught onto this long before Shoigu admitted anything was happening. And when Shoigu admitted it was happening, it contradicted what the Russian politicians had been saying about how this was an aggravation by Ukraine. Shoigu said that this was an aggravation by NATO. Over the course of roughly 2 weeks between Shoigu's announcement that this was in fact a thing and the big exercise at Opuk in Crimea, there was relatively little coverage, but there was this big overt build up. Everybody was talking about it on all sides. And then, as is typical, they declared everything was satisfactory and they went home. Which means, in my opinion, that we're probably entering a period of reasonably higher tension in the possibly higher tension in the short term, because again, it's no longer attributed by the Russian military. So the eye is going to be a bit more wary in terms of what's going on. Whereas during that second phase, when Shoigu admitted that something was happening, I honestly had my suspicions substantially decrease since all element of surprise was lost. Now that we're sort of expecting the Russians to go home because this is the end of the conscription season, and they had their big Victory Day parade, and supposedly this is now commanders' conference season where they're going to talk about their training objectives met over the past several months and what they're planning to do for the summer training season. This is a time when I could be genuinely surprised, i.e. when the Russians would attack and would move back. So we know from experience, the Russians don't announce, oh, we're doing this big buildup and then we're going to attack. The Russians just go in a way that you don't expect. So when I hear people say, oh, they're not moving logistics to the front, that really doesn't interest me because it's the forces that are at the front starting from their standing positions is how Russia would actually do a major offensive against Ukraine. The logistics would show up. It would be kind of a mess at the beginning, but the whole point is it would be an equal amount of mess on the other side, and they might just get lucky. So that is the major takeaway I have here, is that just because I can read all of the Ministry of Defense press releases doesn't necessarily mean I know anything about what Russia is actually planning to do. What it means is I know what the Russians are going to tell me about what the training is. I know that's not going to surprise many people watching, but it's something that we need to bear in mind as we think about how Russia signals or doesn't signal that a conflict is coming. So I'll stop sharing there. I'm happy to take any questions you've got.
What does that mean for, first, Ukraine, its political attempts to enter NATO? And of course, what does that mean for Belarus and the turmoil, political turmoil that is broiling there, and the presence of Russians in Belarus? And of course, later on, I'll ask you a question what it means for Poland, of course.
Right. So for Ukrainian NATO aspirations, it's difficult to parse what the game plan is on either side. We know from mostly Belarusian sources that the Russians are talking about this a lot more at the higher levels of government that they have in the past. And this is most likely due to the fact that Zelensky's government is really pushing, trying to get into NATO the past year. They've been going to any NATO country that they can find and demanding, can we get a membership action plan as rapidly as possible? This is the membership action plan, or the MAP, is basically the proximate step to getting into NATO. And by tradition, anybody who gets one gets in sooner or later with virtually no further roadblocks once they achieve the list of objectives in it. And they're getting pushed back by the West at the moment, mostly out of disinterest in trying to take up the fight that the Ukrainians have with the Russians. But it does show that the Russians don't necessarily need to do too much activity in order to get the West to remember that taking on Ukraine is potentially a huge liability if the intention is to restabilize relations with Russia, which is what the United States is openly seeking, though to be honest with you, I'm really confused by what Blinken and the Biden administration are actually trying to accomplish with the all of the above policy that they're currently going at. And I think Russians are equally confused. So until that gets sorted out, we're sort of in this limbo where we don't know where things are going. It can be said, I think, pretty confidently that especially in Northern Europe, the appetite for restabilizing relations with Russia is pretty much gone. There is an interest in trying to get Nord Stream 2 finished for a whole in Germany and Denmark in order to restabilize energy prices, but that's about all they're interested in stabilizing with a Russia relationship. In terms of Belarus, I think this is actually an important moment we should bear in mind here. So I've said in the past that the key point of Russian troops not being in Belarus is that we have a signaling capability here, even if it's just at the classified level, that if the Russians are thinking about a serious attack into the Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, or against Poland itself, they need to have some contingency in Belarus. And that's going to mean a whole bunch of messages back and forth between Moscow and saying, yeah, we're coming, whether you like it or not. And we'd be able to see that traffic. If the Russians have a whole bunch of forces already in Belarus at any given time, we are just not going to see that. My expectation is that when the time comes, maybe there'll be some political statements in advance, but we are going to see virtually no military intelligence about how this starts. And a good example I'd have here is, if you remember from the beginning of the Syria campaign, the whole thing started while Lavrov was in New York City for the UN General Assembly with a bunch of talking points that Russia's not going to intervene in Syria. And the Russian Air Force just shows up at an Iranian airbase saying, yeah, hey, good to see you. We're going to be based here for a couple of months, like bombing terrorists in Syria. And the Iranians said, no, you gotta leave. Because they had not planned this in advance. They just decided that this was going to be a convenient base to use. So the Russians ended up being there for, I think, 48 hours before they had to go home. They ended up being based in North Ossetia for most of the campaign, in addition to the forces they actually had in Syria itself. So the big recalibration I would have here is that just because we can see a whole bunch of interesting things going on in Russia, including through open source intelligence, watching tanks moving around within Russia and tracking trains and things of that nature, or just reading all of what Russia says and trying to discern, is this actually a time of increased readiness? I don't think we're really going to see any of that in the event of a real crisis. And so what I'm saying is that you shouldn't come to me for whether or not this is a real war to come. Instead, you should come to me to find out, have the Russians practiced this option. And I suspect that means if Belarus remains in a state of political precariousness, where they have to accept whatever Putin's going to say, then as soon as we see something of even a brigade size of forces inside of Belarus, it's almost going to necessitate a much more constant readiness on Poland's side, simply because we will not know until probably about H-12 hours in advance, that the Russians are in fact getting ready to attack. I think that's something that we need to bear in mind when we watch the debate going on between Putin and Lukashenko at the moment. Arseny Savitsky just had the Belarusian reservist observer just had an article, I think yesterday, in the Eurasia Daily Monitor, saying that Lukashenko is completely open to the joint air patrols with Russia. We saw some of them restart last year even, but he's still resisting putting a base in Belarusian territory. We will see how long that holds up. But if Putin keeps pushing and Lukashenko runs out of options, this might really start to change a number of the working assumptions of just what is daily military intelligence life like in Central Europe.
And when do you expect this to happen? This sort of no option threshold for Lukashenko?
It's very hard to say. Lukashenko is always proven very good at slow rolling any crisis that's coming at him. When something is quite pressing, he knows how to just be murderously brutal in order to restabilize things, as he would put it. At the moment, the signals I'm seeing from the Minsk Foreign Office operations, such as they are, is that they are really pushing for China and India to counterbalance Russia in terms of its foreign policy. So until 2019, Minsk was very big about how we still have semi-functional relationships with all of our neighbors to the West. The West was equally happy to say that, look, we have some degree of leverage inside Putin's empire. That has completely fallen apart. The only relationship going on between Belarus and its immediate neighbors to the West is occasional Happy Independence Day messages that Lukashenko signs off on in order to make it seem like everything's okay. We have seen the French resend a new ambassador to Minsk, and the Germans have talked to them a couple of times, but it's very limited. But meanwhile, Lukashenko, the Belarusian government has really, really invested in the Great Stone Industrial Park, trying to get as much Chinese companies into Minsk in order to increase its value in China. And then we've also seen the hapless Indian ambassador to Belarus, who's probably not the most talented of Indian diplomats, being sent to some backwater, being called into the Foreign Office once a week, much more frequently than before, in order to see what options there are to use some sort of Eurasian balance. So, and then we've also seen Belarus doing big things in Turkey as well. Considering all of that, I don't think Lukashenko thinks he has run out of options. I do perceive that he's certainly giving up ground in as much as he's doing these joint air patrols. He's talking to Putin much more frequently than I'm sure he wants to. They don't get along together personally, as everybody knows. And he's also continuing to talk about constitutional reform, which is something that any Russian diplomat going to Minsk will only talk about these days. So if you need to do constitutional reform, and at some point you need to step down as part of this grand deal. And I'm guessing that whenever it comes to the point that the Russians insist on when is the date for the referendum on a constitutional reform that says that you're going to be leaving office, that's going to be when Lukashenko puts the base option on the table. I suspect he's going to start with an air base because that's a bit less significant, but we'll see just what comes of that.
And what does that mean for Poland? We've covered already the need to have the full combat readiness and more completion in ranks in the east. But how about other things? The milestones for our foreign policy, to see how Lukashenko is giving up, like on constitution, on the base and so on. What would you say? What would you recommend?
In the very short term, the most important thing Poland can do is make sure it has a strong diplomatic presence in Minsk to know what is happening there. And I know at the moment it's quite difficult because there's all these persona non grata exchanges going on. There's almost no trust. President Duda is talking with the Polish minority organization in Belarus constantly in order to make it seem that there is protection going on. But even if it can't be done through overt diplomacy, Warsaw needs intelligence, even if it's not done by Polish diplomats themselves, but through Polish allies elsewhere in Minsk. They need to know what is the state of the debate. And that's the very short-term issue. In the medium term, you need to start, Poland at large needs to start figuring out, as the Russians increase presence in Belarus, whatever scenario that occurs, how much readiness is actually going to be necessary. So if it turns out that the Russians are just moving a motor rifle battalion into Minsk, that's not nearly as urgent as a motor rifle brigade in Brest. So you need to start seriously thinking out for what would be the appropriate degree of readiness as a constant in order to do certain responses if the Russians are suddenly going to show up at the border. I think that the ongoing assumption that the Belarusian forces themselves, the Belarusian armed forces, are not going to be in the vanguard of any Russian attack on Europe is probably still true. Though I do think that they are going to be more willing to act as a rearguard reserve and a territorial holding unit than we're admitting to ourselves at this point. Not that I think there's going to be too much territory to hold. I think this is much more going to be a shock operation type thing, but still you can't rule that out really anymore. Also cannot rule out the possibility that the two Belarusian mobile brigades are going to be much more loyal to the Russians than the other Belarusian units, simply because they have substantially more contact and interoperability. And I would not be surprised if reintroducing Russian officers into their command structure is already underway or just around the corner. I obviously have not seen anything in public saying that they are there, but I would not be tremendously surprised if that is in fact the case or imminently the case. So short term, much more intelligence is needed about what is the state of the consensus within Lukashenko's own mind, as much as it can be known, and the Belarusian Security Council as to what concessions are now on the table to Moscow. And secondly, having a schedule of what is going to be the appropriate amount of response and purely domestic response. I don't think relying on Americans, more Americans, is a very wise move at this point. That the Poles will be able to respond to within the Eastern Triangle of Polish territory. I don't think it's going to be like we need the whole 11th division constantly at 100% readiness 24/7. I don't think it's going to be that bad, but you do need to start having what is the immediate response capability, and then how do we get up to 100% readiness within 48 hours that we are ready to respond when that happens.
Fair enough, Nick. Thank you very much. That was a brief update on the strategic outcomes of the Russian posturing, let me put it that way, around Ukraine in the eastern frontier, the eastern flank, the eastern front of Europe. Our guest was Nicholas Myers. Thank you, Nick. And you stay tuned to Strategy and Future, more episodes with Nick and more issues to follow. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jacek.